The moment Margaret Sullivan heard the opening notes of Puccini's O mio babbino caro drifting through the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom, her hands began to tremble. The cleaning spray bottle slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. For 30 years, she had successfully hidden who she really was. For 30 years, no one at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Manhattan had suspected that the quiet elderly cleaning woman spoke 5 languages fluently, or had once commanded standing ovations from audiences of thousands at the world's greatest opera houses. But tonight, as the hotel's charity gala descended into chaos because the featured soprano had collapsed backstage, Margaret's carefully constructed invisibility was about to shatter. What the arrogant manager who had spent months tormenting her didn't know was that he was about to witness the most humiliating moment of his career. And it would be delivered by the 65-year-old woman he had just called worthless. But first, Margaret Sullivan would have to survive the cruelest night of humiliation she had faced in 3 decades. Margaret Sullivan woke to her alarm at 5:30 a.m. From the window of her tiny studio apartment in Queens, she could see the Manhattan skyline glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. On the walls around her were frames containing photographs of another life. 1985, La Scala Opera House, Milan. Young Margaret in a crimson velvet gown under brilliant spotlights. 1988, Vienna State Opera. Center stage, hands frozen in dramatic gesture, the orchestra behind her. 1992, Metropolitan Opera House, New York. Backstage, laughing with Maestro Giuseppe Bellini, Margaret avoided looking at the frames. Every morning, the same ritual: wake up, dress, become invisible. She arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel at 6:45 a.m. Slipping quietly through the employee entrance, she scanned her ID and headed for the supply closet. When she passed other cleaning staff, she only nodded slightly. They spoke Spanish to each other. Margaret pretended she only spoke English. In truth, she spoke 5 languages fluently, but language skills invited questions. Questions brought up the past. As she began cleaning the hotel's magnificent lobby, manager Derek Harrison emerged from his office. At 38, Harrison was the hotel owner's nephew, which gave him the illusion of being untouchable. "Sullivan!" His voice echoed across the lobby. "There are fingerprints on those display cases. Didn't I tell you to clean them yesterday?" Margaret quietly bowed her head. "Yes, Mr. Harrison, I'll take care of it right away." "Not right away. Now. The gala guests start arriving in 2 hours, and I will not have this hotel embarrassed because of you." A few early arriving guests in the lobby turned their heads, some curious, some pitying. No one intervened. No one ever did. As Margaret walked toward the display case, Harrison's voice followed her. "And Sullivan? Tonight during the gala, you stay on the upper floors. I don't want to see you in any guest areas. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Harrison walked away smiling. As Margaret bent over the display case with her cleaning cloth, she noticed her fingers trembling slightly. The arthritis was getting worse every day. Once, these hands had made graceful gestures in the air on the world's greatest opera stages. Now, she wondered if they were strong enough to wipe down a glass case. But no one would ever know that. Never. From her corner table in the lobby cafe, 28-year-old journalist Rachel Foster had been watching the elderly cleaning woman for 3 days. Something didn't add up. The way Margaret Sullivan moved through the hotel was different from other cleaning staff. There was a grace to her posture, a precision to her movements that seemed almost choreographed. And yesterday, Rachel had overheard her speaking perfect Italian to a confused tourist. Not broken, functional Italian, but the fluid, musical Italian of someone who had lived in the language. Now, as manager Derek Harrison publicly berated Margaret in front of a lobby full of guests, Rachel pulled out her phone and started recording. Her journalist instincts told her she was about to witness something important. She had no idea she was about to capture the most viral moment of the year. Rachel wasn't just interested in Margaret. The hotel staff dynamics were strange too. Other cleaning staff looked at Margaret with sympathy, but no one helped her, talked to her, or even showed support from a distance. There was fear in the air. "Why is everyone so afraid of this woman?" Rachel whispered, sipping her coffee. She wrote quickly in her notebook. Margaret Sullivan, approximately 65 years old, American, but speaks perfect Italian. Manager Harrison's target. Staff won't help her. Why? Rachel was an investigative journalist. She had mastered finding big truths beneath small stories. And around Margaret Sullivan, she sensed a deeply hidden story. That evening at 6 p.m., as gala preparations began, Rachel obtained a press pass from the hotel reception. "I'm covering the charity event," she said with a smile, "for a local magazine." In truth, she was following Margaret Sullivan. 1992, Metropolitan Opera House, New York. "Brava, brava, Margaret!" The audience's standing ovation made the walls of the Metropolitan Opera House vibrate. 35-year-old Margaret Sullivan stood on stage in a red gown, tears streaming down her cheeks as she bowed. She had just completed the role of Violetta in Verdi's La Traviata, and critics were beginning to call her one of the greatest sopranos of her generation. Backstage, her husband and manager, David Sullivan, spun her in his arms. "Darling, after tonight we're going to get offers from every opera house in the world. Paris, London, Berlin, everywhere." Margaret smiled, but there was a growing unease inside her. Over the past few months, David's behavior had changed. More defensive, more controlling, more desperate. "David, is everything okay? You've been tense lately." "Everything's perfect, sweetheart. Just some business complications. But don't worry, I'll handle it." Margaret didn't know that night that David's business was actually a massive financial disaster. For years, David had been managing Margaret's career and spending much of their income on risky investments. And he had lost everything. 3 months later, when the truth came out, Margaret's life shattered. 1993, Manhattan. "What do you mean we've lost everything?" Margaret stood frozen in the living room of their luxury Manhattan apartment, reading the documents in David's trembling hands. "Bankruptcy? Foreclosure? David, how did this happen?" David buried his face in his hands. "I tried to fix it, Margaret. I tried to make it better, but the debt's piled up too high. Creditors are going to seize everything. The apartment, the cars, the savings, everything." Margaret's world spun. "But I have opera contracts. I can keep working, pay off the debts." "No." David's voice was harsh. "The creditors are going to seize your earnings too. Everything will go toward debt payment. And—" He paused. "The scandal, Margaret. When this gets out, it'll be everywhere. Famous soprano's husband commits financial fraud. Your career's over, and it truly was over." The news spread within weeks. Newspapers ran headlines about the Sullivan fraud scandal. Margaret's name was dragged through it all. Opera houses canceled contracts. Agents stopped returning calls. Even former colleagues began keeping their distance. Within a year, Margaret Sullivan, the Metropolitan Opera's nightingale, had become someone no one cared about. David couldn't bear the shame and guilt. In 1994, he died of a heart attack. He was 37 years old. Margaret was 36, left with a shattered career, mountains of debt, and a spirit that had completely lost the courage to sing. 30 years later. Margaret kept these memories in a small wooden box she kept locked. Old press clippings, photographs, programs. Sometimes at night she looked at them, but she never made a sound, because singing meant opening the deepest layer of pain. And for 30 years, Margaret Sullivan had learned to survive, not to shine. The Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and gold decorations. The guest list of 500 consisted of the city's wealthiest and most influential people. Tonight's art and culture charity gala, organized by the hotel, was designed to raise donations for the local opera house. The irony would have squeezed Margaret's heart, if she had any heart left in her. The gala was set to begin at 7 p.m., and Margaret's job was simple: clean the guest rooms on the upper floors and stay away from the lobby. Manager Harrison had made his instructions very clear that morning. "I don't want to see you during the gala, Sullivan. Our philanthropists shouldn't see hotel staff wandering around, especially someone like you." The phrase, "someone like you," hung in the air. Old, poor, invisible. At 6:30 p.m., Margaret pushed her cleaning cart to the 5th floor. She was directly above the ballroom and could hear soft notes of music through the walls. A piano was playing, probably a pianist warming up for the gala. Margaret stopped. She recognized the melody. Chopin, Nocturne Opus 9, number 2. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back on those stages. Spotlights on her face, orchestra behind her, that moment when her voice reached every corner of the hall. Then, the sound of a door opening upstairs brought her back to reality. "Excuse me, ma'am," Margaret said automatically, thinking she was in a guest's way. But no one was there. The door slammed again, harder this time. Margaret looked toward Suite 512 at the end of the corridor. It was the hotel's most luxurious suite, reserved for the gala, but no one was staying there. At least, not as far as Margaret knew. Curious and a bit anxious, Margaret approached the suite's door. It was slightly ajar. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. Margaret pushed the door open and looked inside. The suite was empty, but something caught her attention. A piano. The room contained a large, grand piano, probably for VIP guests before the gala. And the piano was open, with an unfinished score on it. Margaret stepped closer to look. The score was Puccini's O mio babbino caro. Margaret's heart began racing. She had last sung this song 30 years ago at that final concert in New York. She touched the piano keys. No dust, freshly tuned. Who was staying in this suite, and why was this score here? Just then, a scream rose from the ballroom. When Margaret burst from the suite, hotel staff were running everywhere. Someone was shouting, "Call a doctor." Another voice, "Ambulance!" Margaret ran to the stairs and descended to the 4th floor, to the backstage area directly behind the ballroom. The door was open, and chaos reigned inside. Soprano Isabella Martinez, tonight's featured artist, was sitting on the floor, struggling to breathe. Her assistant was panicking. "What happened?" asked a nearby waiter. "Allergic reaction," said the assistant. "She ate something at dinner. Now her throat is swelling." "She needs to get to the hospital." Manager Derek Harrison was in the middle of the scene, phone to his ear, looking panicked. "What do you mean there's no backup soprano? Can't you find another professional soprano in this city?" The person on the other end of the phone was clearly giving a negative answer because Harrison's face turned red. "This is impossible. We have 500 guests who paid for a live performance. We can't get away with playing recorded music." Margaret stood at the doorway, watching silently. A voice inside her said, "Walk away, this isn't your problem." But another voice, one she had suppressed for 30 years, whispered, "But you can sing. You can still sing. Number." Margaret shook her head. No, she couldn't. She'd been invisible for 30 years. She couldn't step into the spotlight now. Just as she was about to turn and leave, a young woman, journalist Rachel Foster, who had been watching Margaret from the cafe, appeared on the other side of the door. "Excuse me," Rachel said to Harrison, "but there's someone in the lobby who says she can sing." Harrison turned furiously. "Who?" Rachel looked at Margaret, and in that moment, Margaret Sullivan's life changed forever. The backstage area fell into stunned silence as all eyes turned to Margaret Sullivan, standing in her stained cleaning uniform at the doorway. Derek Harrison's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then fury. "Are you out of your mind? This woman is a cleaning lady." Rachel Foster stepped forward, her phone still recording. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrison, do you have any other options?" "The guests are waiting, and unless you have a professional soprano hidden somewhere." "This is absurd!" Harrison turned to his assistant. "Emily, call the Opera House again. Call every theater in Manhattan. There has to be someone—" "Mr. Harrison." Emily's voice was quiet but firm. "It's 6:45 p.m. on a Saturday night. Every professional soprano in the city is already performing somewhere or unavailable. I've called 17 people. No one can get here in time." Harrison's jaw clenched. He looked at the guests beginning to fill the ballroom through the partially open door, then back at Margaret with pure contempt. "Fine," he spat. "But when this woman embarrasses this hotel and ruins our reputation, I want everyone here to remember that this was not my idea." He pointed a finger at Margaret. "You have exactly 15 minutes to do whatever you're going to do. And Sullivan? When this disaster is over, you're fired." Margaret felt her throat tighten. For 30 years she had hidden. For 30 years she had been safe in her invisibility. Now that safety was being ripped away. But as she looked past Harrison into the ballroom, she saw something that made her decision for her. On the program board near the entrance, written in elegant script, "Tonight's performance, selections from Italian opera featuring Puccini's O mio babbino caro in memory of Maestro Giuseppe Bellini, 1934 to 2024. Maestro Bellini, her teacher, her mentor, the man who had told her on that last day before the scandal broke. Margaret, whatever happens in life, never let them take your voice. The voice is not yours. It belongs to the music, and the music is eternal." He had died 2 months ago. Margaret had seen the obituary in the newspaper but hadn't attended the memorial service. She had told herself she no longer belonged to that world, but now, seeing his name on that program, Margaret felt something break open inside her chest, not her heart, her fear. "I need access to the costume room," Margaret said quietly. "And 15 minutes to prepare," Harrison sneered. "The costume room is for actual performers, not—" "Give her whatever she needs." Everyone turned to see an elderly man in an expensive tuxedo standing in the backstage entrance. This was Thomas Whitmore, owner of the Grand Meridian Hotel and Derek Harrison's uncle. "Uncle Thomas, this woman is not qualified." "Derek." Thomas's voice was soft but carried absolute authority. "You've created this crisis through poor planning. This woman is offering a solution. Either accept it gracefully or explain to 500 wealthy donors why they're getting a refund." Thomas turned to Margaret. "What's your name?" "Margaret Sullivan, sir." "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, the stage is yours if you want it. No pressure, no judgment. But if Maestro Bellini meant something to you," he gestured to the program board, "then perhaps this is meant to be." Margaret's hands were shaking, but she nodded. "I'll need that 15 minutes." In the hotel's small costume room, Margaret stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The hotel staff had found a simple but elegant black evening gown that fit her perfectly. Someone had helped arrange her silver-gray hair into a classic upswept style. The transformation was shocking. But it wasn't the dress or the hair that made Margaret's breath catch. It was her own eyes in the mirror. For the first time in 30 years, they weren't looking down. They were looking straight ahead. Rachel Foster appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Sullivan, they're ready for you. The maestro from the hotel orchestra wants to do a quick run-through." "No." Margaret's voice was surprisingly steady. "No run-through. If I think too much, I'll lose my nerve. Just tell the pianist to follow my tempo. They'll know." Rachel studied her carefully. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been researching you for the past 15 minutes. Margaret Sullivan performed at La Scala, Vienna State Opera, the Met, called The Nightingale by the New York Times in 1992. Then, nothing. You disappeared." Margaret met Rachel's eyes in the mirror. "Not disappeared. I hid. There's a difference." "Why?" "Because sometimes survival means becoming invisible." Margaret turned from the mirror. "Are you going to write about this?" Rachel hesitated. "That depends. Do you want me to?" Margaret thought about Derek Harrison's sneering face, about 30 years of someone like you, about being told to stay out of sight. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Yes, I do." Because maybe there are other people out there who think they have to stay invisible to survive. Maybe they need to know it's possible to step back into the light. As they walked toward the stage entrance, Margaret could hear the murmur of 500 guests in the ballroom. Her heart was pounding so hard, She thought it might break through her chest. At the stage entrance, Derek Harrison waited with barely contained fury. The guests have been told there's been a delightful surprise change in tonight's program. Try not to make me look like a complete fool. Thomas Whitmore stood beside his nephew, and for just a moment his eyes met Margaret's. He nodded slightly, a gesture of encouragement. The hotel's orchestra conductor, a young woman named Elena Rodriguez, approached Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm told you'll be singing O mio babino caro. Do you need the sheet music?" "No," Margaret said. "I know it by heart. Start in E-flat major, moderate tempo. I'll guide you." Elena's eyebrows rose in surprise. That was the professional soprano's way of giving direction. "Understood." As Elena walked back to the orchestra pit, Rachel whispered to Margaret, "Are you ready?" Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath, exactly as Maestro Bellini had taught her 40 years ago. Control the breath. Control the emotion. "No," Margaret whispered, "but I'm doing it anyway." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The audience quieted, and Margaret Sullivan stepped onto the stage for the first time in 30 years. For a moment, Margaret simply stood at center stage, blinking in the spotlight. The ballroom stretched before her, crystal chandeliers, elegantly dressed guests, tables covered in white linen and candlelight. She heard the whispers immediately. "Who is that?" "I thought Isabella Martinez was performing." Is that one of the hotel staff?" Derek Harrison stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage. He was waiting for her to fail. But Thomas Whitmore sat at the front table, leaning forward with genuine curiosity, and Rachel Foster stood at the side entrance, her phone recording everything. Margaret found the microphone stand and adjusted it slowly. Her hands were trembling, but she forced them steady. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am not the performer you were expecting tonight. I am." She paused and for a wild moment thought about saying, "just a cleaning woman." But then she saw Maestro Bellini's name on the program board at the side of the stage. "I am a soprano," she said instead, her voice stronger now. "And 30 years ago, I had the honor of studying under Maestro Giuseppe Bellini, whose memory we honor tonight." The whispers grew louder. Several guests pulled out their phones, searching her name. "I know many of you came here expecting a polished, professional performance from a recognized artist. I cannot promise you perfection. I can only promise you honesty." Margaret turned to the orchestra. "Tonight I sing for Maestro Bellini, who taught me that the music doesn't belong to us. We only borrow it for a moment and pass it on." She nodded to Elena Rodriguez. The piano began the opening notes of O mio babino caro, and Margaret opened her mouth and sang. The first note hung in the air like a prayer. O mio babino caro. In the back of the ballroom, Derek Harrison's smirk began to fade. Margaret's voice wasn't young anymore. It didn't have the crystalline perfection of her performances 40 years ago. There were rough edges, signs of age, the tremor of emotion barely contained. But it had something else, something that made every person in that ballroom stop moving, stop whispering, stop breathing. It had truth. Mi piace è bello, bello. The voice carried pain and hope, loss and rediscovery, 30 years of silence breaking open into sound. It wasn't just a performance. It was a resurrection. In the third row, a woman in diamonds began crying quietly. At the side entrance, Rachel Foster's hands were shaking as she held her phone, tears streaming down her face as she recorded. And at the center table, Thomas Whitmore closed his eyes, remembering the last time he had heard a voice with this kind of raw, emotional power. It had been 1992 at the Metropolitan Opera, when a young soprano named Margaret Sullivan had brought an entire audience to tears. Vorrei morire. As Margaret reached the climax of the aria, her voice soaring to the high notes she hadn't attempted in decades, something extraordinary happened. The voice was there. Changed, yes. Older, yes, but still there. still powerful, still able to crack open the human heart and reach inside. Oh Dio, vorrei morir. The final note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Then the ballroom exploded. 500 people rose to their feet simultaneously. The applause was deafening, thunderous, as if the building itself was shaking. Several people were openly weeping. Others were shouting, "Brava! Brava!" Margaret stood at center stage, tears streaming down her face, unable to process what was happening. The applause continued for a full 3 minutes. Elena Rodriguez, the conductor, was crying. The orchestra musicians were standing and applauding. Even the waitstaff at the edges of the room had stopped working to watch. And at the back of the ballroom, Derek Harrison stood frozen, his face pale, realizing that he had just witnessed something he would never be able to dismiss or diminish. As the applause finally began to fade, Thomas Whitmore walked onto the stage. He approached Margaret and took her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "I believe we have just witnessed something truly special. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan." He turned to her. "Would you be willing to share your story with us?" Margaret looked out at the faces in the audience. For 30 years she had hidden her story, believing it was shameful. But looking at these people, many crying, all transformed by what they had just heard, she realized something. Her story wasn't shameful. It was human. 30 years ago, Margaret began, her voice quiet but steady. I was a professional soprano. I performed at many of the world's great opera houses. And then I lost everything. My husband made financial decisions that ruined us. The scandal destroyed my career. I became invisible by choice because I thought it was the only way to survive. She paused, looking toward the back of the room where Derek Harrison stood. For the past 5 years, I have worked as a cleaning woman at this hotel. I have been treated as invisible by many people. Some were simply indifferent. Others, she let the sentence hang. Others were deliberately cruel. The audience followed her gaze to Derek Harrison. Several people whispered, recognizing the hotel manager. But tonight, I learned something. Being invisible is not the same as being gone. The voice I thought I had lost was only hidden. And sometimes we need the right moment and the right reason to find it again. The applause began again, softer this time, but no less emotional. Thomas Whitmore spoke quietly to Margaret, off microphone. "Mrs. Sullivan, effective immediately, you are no longer employed as cleaning staff at this hotel. How would you feel about a position as our cultural arts director? We host events like this regularly, and we need someone with real knowledge and passion." Margaret's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore, The salary is $85,000 annually, with full benefits. You would coordinate performances, work with artists, and help us create meaningful cultural events. And," he smiled gently, "you would never have to be invisible again." Margaret couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears flowing freely. As Thomas helped her off the stage, Derek Harrison approached, his face a mixture of fury and fear. "Uncle Thomas, surely you can't be serious about—" "Derek!" Thomas's voice was ice. "You have spent months tormenting a woman who has more talent and grace in her smallest finger than you have in your entire body. You deliberately tried to make her invisible because her presence somehow threatened your fragile ego." He stepped closer to his nephew. "Effective immediately, you are demoted to assistant manager. Your replacement will be someone who understands that every person in this hotel, from the CEO to the cleaning staff, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Derek's face went from red to white. "You can't do this. I'm family, which is exactly why I'm not firing you entirely, but your behavior tonight was unacceptable, and it ends now." As Derek stumbled away, Rachel Foster approached Margaret with her still recording phone. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Rachel Foster, freelance journalist. With your permission, I'd like to tell your story. I think people need to hear it." Margaret looked at the young woman's earnest face. "Why?" Why does my story matter? Because you're not the only person who's ever felt invisible, Rachel said softly. And you're not the only person who's been told to stay in the shadows. But tonight, you showed that it's never too late to step back into the light. Margaret nodded. Then yes, tell the story, all of it. The Grand Meridian Hotel's website now featured a news section, Cultural Arts Events, curated by Margaret Sullivan, former Metropolitan Opera soprano. Rachel Foster's article, titled The Invisible Woman, How a Hotel Cleaning Lady Became an Opera Star Again, had gone viral with over 15 million views. Margaret's performance video had been shared across every social media platform, viewed by millions worldwide. But the numbers weren't what mattered to Margaret. What mattered was the email she received from a woman in Ohio. I'm 58 and I thought my dreams were dead. After seeing your video, I enrolled in the art classes I'd always wanted to take. Thank you for showing me it's not too late. And the letter from a teenager in California. My dad lost his job and felt ashamed. Your story helped him understand that setbacks don't define who you are. He's back in school now, training for a new career. And the hundreds of other messages from people who had felt invisible, overlooked, dismissed, and who found courage in Margaret's story. The hotel's cultural arts program had become wildly successful. Margaret had brought in young artists, established performers, and community programs. The ballroom that had once hosted only wealthy galas now offered free monthly concerts for local schools. Derek Harrison had quietly resigned 2 months after the incident and taken a position at a much smaller hotel in New Jersey. He never publicly acknowledged what had happened, but those who knew him said he was different, quieter, more humble, and Thomas Whitmore had made substantial donations to opera programs for underprivileged youth, establishing the Maestro Giuseppe Bellini Scholarship in honor of the teacher who had believed in Margaret decades ago. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Margaret stood in the ballroom, setting up for that evening's community concert. She was wearing professional business attire now, her silver hair styled elegantly, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had reclaimed her identity. Rachel Foster walked in, notebook in hand. Margaret, I'm doing a follow-up article. 3 months later, where is she now? Can I ask you a few questions? Margaret smiled. Of course. Do you ever regret those 30 years? Do you wish you had stepped forward sooner? Margaret thought carefully. I used to. But now I realize that every experience shaped who I am. Those 30 years taught me humility, compassion, and the ability to see people who others overlook. I wouldn't trade that wisdom. What would you say to someone who feels invisible right now? Someone who thinks they've missed their chance? Margaret's eyes were bright. I would say that being invisible by necessity is not the same as being invisible by nature. Your voice is still there. Your talents are still there. Your worth is still there. Sometimes we just need the right moment and the courage to take it, to step back into the light. She paused, looking around the ballroom where she had once stood trembling in a cleaning uniform. And I would tell them that it's never, ever too late to reclaim who you really are. As the sun set over Manhattan, the ballroom filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, and circumstances. Margaret stood at the microphone, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. Good evening, she said with a warm smile. Welcome to the Grand Meridian Cultural Arts Concert. Tonight, we celebrate the power of music to transform lives, to heal wounds, and to remind us that every voice matters. The lights dimmed, the orchestra began to play, and Margaret Sullivan, no longer invisible, no longer hidden, sang.